Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the American Logistics Aid Network, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the International City-County Management Association, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will conclude our America in Transition webinar series that kicked off at the end of last year, discussing what leaders need to know as we head into 2023. Our panel today will reflect on the diverse threats that we discussed earlier in the series, and will explore what this means for leaders, Homeland Security leaders, and national leaders nationwide today and over the next few years. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Mike Byrne. Mike is a long-serving member of the instructional and subject matter expert team here at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. Mike is a specialist executive at Deloitte now, building a distinguished career of expertise in almost every sector of Homeland Security and emergency management. Mike served for 20 years in the New York Fire Department and for 20 years in a variety of disaster response and recovery leadership roles at FEMA, DHS, and at the White House. He's also led efforts in these areas with the American Red Cross and Microsoft, so he brings a wealth of experience in both government and the private sector to today's conversations. Mike, thanks for moderating today, and now I'll turn the program over to you.
Dawn, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. I think it's going to be incredibly rewarding because we've assembled a team of extraordinary panelists to join me in this conversation today. And without further ado, I'd like to just introduce the panel. The first panelist is Dr. Christopher Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is the director of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency in Washington, D.C. In this role, Dr. Rodriguez serves as the Homeland Security Advisor and State Coordinating Officer for the District of Columbia. He also is the State Administrative Agent for all Homeland Security federal grants funding for both the district and the National Capital Region. He led the agency through COVID-19 pandemic, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, and numerous other critical incidents and planned special events. HCEMA is responsible for emergency planning, preparedness, response, and recovery for the city, and HCEMA houses the district's Emergency Operations Center, District Watch Center, and the District Fusion Center. Prior to joining HCEMA, Dr. Rodriguez served as the director of the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness from 2014 to 17, where he led statewide strategies, policies, and operations on counterterrorism, resiliency, and cybersecurity. While serving in New Jersey, his home state, Dr. Rodriguez led the office during a national rise in homegrown violence and extremism and established close relationships with the private sector, federal, state, and local law enforcement. Our next panelist is Rebecca Ryan. Rebecca is a futurist, author, and entrepreneur. She is the founder of Next Generation Consulting and has held residencies at the Alliance for Innovation, the Governing Institute, and the Association of Government Risk Pools. She's on the board, she's the board chairperson and faculty member at the Institute for Zen Leadership. She is also the author of The Next Big Things, The Future of Local Government from 2015, Regeneration, a Manifesto for America's Future Leaders, 2013, and Live First, Work Second, Getting Inside the Head of the Next Generation in 2007. Her TEDx talk, Spring is Coming, was featured at the prestigious 10X Beacon Street in 2015. Welcome, Rebecca. Our next panelist is Francisco Sanchez, Jr. Francisco was appointed in January 2022 by President Biden to serve as the Associate Administrator for the U.S. Small Business Administration, where he oversees the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience and is helping lead the nation's economic recovery from COVID and natural disasters. As the first presidential appointee to this position, Francisco's new role elevates the priority of the business and economic recovery for the U.S. He is an architect of a historic effort by the SBA to reimagine its approach to helping local economies prepare for, respond to, and recover from increasingly frequent catastrophic events. Under his leadership, the SBA is revamping its disaster and resilience expertise by reshaping its programs for the nation's 32.5 million small businesses, homeowners and renters, and private nonprofits to ensure they have the resources they need. Francisco previously served as the Deputy Homeland Security and Emergency Management Coordinator for Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management in Texas, where he was the organization's lead for strategic development, planning, public affairs, and community preparedness initiatives. In his tenure there, the nation's third largest county responded to historic hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, and major industrial incidents while averaging a presidential disaster declaration every 9 months. He also played a leading role in public safety efforts to host major security events like Super Bowl 51, the NCAA finals, and multiple World Series. Welcome, Francisco. Well, for starters, we want to see what our audience is interested in. And so a question was sent out to all of you that are listening right now, and we ask you to respond to it. And the question was, which of the topics, threats discussed during the American Transition Series concern you the most in 2023? And it's always fun to see as the results come in, how it changes. The 4 choices were supply chain and energy sector fragility, global security threats coming to the U.S., more frequent and more complex natural disasters, and evolving enhanced cybersecurity threats. Panelists, this is pretty interesting to me. I mean, that all 4 are getting equal attention. What are your thoughts on this? Chris, could we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And again, thank you to our viewers, and Mike, to you for facilitating this discussion, Rebecca and Francisco. It's great to be on the panel with you. I'll really focus on a couple of them, and it's good to see sort of I don't know if it's good or bad to see an even distribution of threats that we're all concerned about. Certainly those are major ones, and of course themes of this whole program. In terms of global security threats, I'll kind of touch on that really briefly. We certainly, over the last, certainly since 9/11, over the last 20 years, been really focused on international terrorism, and certainly over the last 20 years, the United States, along with its allies, has been very successful in mitigating and almost eradicating the foreign terrorist threat to the United States. And certainly we have not seen another 9/11, which is, I think, a testament to the hard work of the federal government and state and locals as well. It does appear that we are entering a new period, I guess kind of new/old period of great power politics. And we see it playing out across the world. And here in the United States, of course, we see it playing out in a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is pervading really our political environment. And we cannot underestimate the impact and the role of our foreign adversaries in helping to foment a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we find in the United States. This is not a new tactic by our foreign adversaries. It's been going on for decades. It's just sort of looking different now with the proliferation of social media and a population in the United States that is susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. The other threat that I would note, and I'll obviously leave it to the other panelists to discuss other threats as well, is the supply chain. And here in the District of Columbia, when the Colonial Pipeline shut down briefly, we did see impacts to our population, prices at the pump, as well as some of our commodities. We did see some hoarding and some almost panic buying, as we did in the early days of the pandemic as well. And that has impacts. And I think the most important thing for us as Homeland Security professionals and emergency managers is how we're messaging to the public. We spend a lot of time in our agency on public information. And so, I would encourage all of our listeners to make sure that They're doing that in coordination with their leadership, either at the city, state, or federal level, so that we're all speaking with one voice and telling the public what to do. Thanks, Mike.
Chris, thank you. Thanks so much. Rebecca, your thoughts?
Yeah, so it looked like a pretty even distribution for the 500 and some public servants who are with us today, which tells me one of two things. Like, on kind of the funny side, but maybe it's actually true, is, wow, CHDS, you hit it out of the park. Like, you have hit on the 4 topics that people are most interested in. And there's a pretty even distribution among them. But on a more serious tone, the truth is, like, we have a portfolio of things that we have to be paying attention to in the future. And none of them, well, depending on the day, right, none of them is far more important than any of the others. So the ability, I played professional basketball, and when we play defense, we're on our toes. And that is certainly the posture that we need to be in as we face into 2023 and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And Francisco, your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having us on. So it's a great panel to be in, and judging by sort of the answers from the folks, I think they were sort of pulling my brain on what keeps me up at night. I think that those are common issues across the country, and people that are looking at that. What I see across those, 4 specific areas is the interdependencies between all of them, because they all touch on each other. And I think when it comes to supply chain, the economy piece, we have seen the implications of that during COVID in terms of how we approach those things. And so even when it comes to the issue of utilities that was also in there, we see that happening over and over. We saw the ice storm in Texas that happened in 21. We see the issues in California right now that are potentially happening with power. We see the implications of that. So whether those implications are natural disasters or man-made or glitches in a system, those are the kinds of issues we need to take a look at. And I think the interdependencies thing is not only critical for how those really play with each other, but I think moving forward and how we address those. Chris talked a little bit about how we need to work among various levels of government and the private sector on that. And Rebecca touched really sort of the audience here across the board. And so I would encourage folks to not just study the interdependencies among those as we address them, but for a bandwidth issue and a success issue, what are the interdependencies between those of us here at the table and listening to this, between state, local, and federal government and the private sector, to address those and make sure the planning is also integrated in that way to make sure that we're successful. And so for any of those, I've yet to see a plan fully survive its encounter with reality, but that's part of what we do. But making sure that we're all at the table and addressing those interdependent issues in an integrated way is going to be very critical to how we move ahead.
Yeah, I really, want to foot stomp that point about the interdependencies, because that's what rang for me, looking at that too. And certainly we've got to stay on that. I am really blown away that it got such an even, I would have thought that would have been, one of the, but given our audience, and it's a broad spectrum audience, as we've seen, the fact that it was so evenly divided, I think the point about linkages is so critical. And then, Chris, to your point about the changing nature of the risk is just such an important factor. Let's move on to a second question. There's another polling question that we've sent out that will dive a little deeper into some of the issues that we have been coming up in the series of America in Transition. And the second question is, which issues, trends do you think will most impact U.S. Homeland Security in 2023? The 5 points are changes in Homeland Security workplace, diminishing trust in government and institutions, evolving emerging technologies, global U.S. economic trends, and mis- and disinformation. Distrust in government and the divided nature of what's going on seems to have taken the day. Rebecca, would you mind if I went to you first and get your thoughts on that, please?
Sure, happy to. Every Wednesday for an hour, I gather a bunch of local government nerds and we talk about signals of the future. Like, what are some of the things that we're noticing? They're not yet mainstream. They're dotted around the edge. And when I think about trust in local government, which has always been higher than trust in state government, and then the lowest is always trust in the federal government. And for a long time, we've said, well, that's because people can see their local government.
Yeah.
But I think that's changed. I think that the pandemic drove a kind of a stake in the heart of that. And the same tribalism that has affected our national politics are now playing out at the local level. And one of the things that I have been watching is the decline of newsrooms, local newsrooms, because we know that there is a relationship between local news and trust in government. Because when a beat reporter is looking for sticky fingers in local government or trying to track anything that's, might even reek of corruption, people know they're being watched and they hold themselves to a higher standard. This is on the staff side. This is also on the elected side. But with the decline of these newsrooms, two things are happening. One, we're seeing the trust number diminishing, but a second thing is happening, which is this: the reinvention of the local newsroom. So in third or fourth quarter last year, Axios announced a big buyout. And one thing that it is not going to do is get out of the local news business. In fact, they've launched local newsletters, just like an email newsletter, with good local journalism in a very easy to digest and understand format. I think they're in 20 cities now. And so what I find very interesting about this is how the news is recalibrating itself. And you're finding a lot of different changes in the newsroom happening, how news is coming back out. And so I'm interested in following how the uptake of those newsletters happens, if Axios can really make a dent in public trust, and if there's going to be a new way, I suspect there will be, a new way of how we engage in local government, and therefore how we rebuild trust in local government. This is the moment for local government. People have been sitting on the sidelines for a long time. They want to engage. They have opinions. And so this is a grand moment for civic re-engagement.
Wow. That's exciting thinking. Chris, we're 2 years away from an event that certainly had a big impact on all of us, but more I'm sure, especially on you and the role that you play. Your thoughts on this the results of the question that we saw, and some of your experiences.
Yeah, thank you. I want to pick up and put a fine point on what Rebecca was just saying, because it's really, really important. We as a country have had for years, decades, right, a healthy mistrust of the federal government in particular. It's a feature of our democracy and something that I think is important, right, because we can hold political leaders accountable through the ballot box and elect new leaders. What's particularly concerning over the last several years has been an erosion of trust in local in local communities and local elected officials, where citizens are closest to their elected officials. And I'm not trying to sound alarmist, although we did experience January 6th, and many of us on the line, and those who are listening in, experienced in their own communities the riots of 2020 when we had a racial reckoning in this country. And what happens in a democracy when people don't trust that the system works? That is like a bedrock of our system and its success. Democracies are fragile, and they depend largely on people believing that it is the best system and the right system. When you start, to use Rebecca's frame, drive a stake through the heart of that fundamental premise of a democracy, that you don't believe that when you go to the voting box that your ballot is going to be counted, or that there are people behind the scenes who are trying to change election results, not just people elsewhere or somewhere else, but people who are like your neighbors, who are election workers, and you don't trust that, that's a real problem. And what it leads to, I would argue, is the tragedy that we saw on January 6th of 2021, when people came to our city largely based on a lie. And believed that they had the ability to stop Congress from doing its constitutional duty. We had residents and people in the EOC that day who had family members on the Hill, and who were personally affected by that day. And we are still grappling with the mental health impacts of seeing Confederate flags flying in the Capitol. Of seeing, in some cases, the Nazi swastika in the Capitol building. These are real issues, and if distrust in government isn't a concern for people, and I'm glad to see that it is for most of our participants, we really need to start addressing that.
Yeah, that's very profound, Chris. I think this is going to be, the issue of our generation almost at this point in time. But Francisco, when we start questioning trust in government, what, certainly you right now and me in my past, we were all about helping people when people need help the most, right? And if we start to see this erosion in trust, what kind of impacts do you think it's going to have on the industry of disaster response and recovery and resilience, especially being able to build back better?
Yeah, that's a concern for us, and it's something absolutely essential as we have this issue of this growing discourse in government and civics that has taken a turn for the worst. One of the things I've been deeply committed to is ensuring that, at least in the disaster space and the recovery and the resilience, that we have open lines of communication. While I come from a red state appointed by a blue president, I had probably spent more time in Florida, Kentucky, Oklahoma, in rural communities to build that trust, to make sure that our partners know that recovery and resilience is a national issue, that it's one that we're deeply committed to, and it is one in which politics really doesn't have a space to play. And so I think both at the state, federal, and local levels, there's a responsibility for folks to ensure that expectation is there, that make sure we set that tone and that standard, and that nothing else really ought to get in the way of us fulfilling that job. I think Rebecca and Chris touched on this a little bit, but one of the things I continue to see, part of this evolution in discourse and some of the issue of trust, you're seeing the growth of what I refer to as the city states, where cities and local communities are taking on more issues, either because they can't be solved at the state or federal level, or it takes a long time to get over the finish line. I think the other point in terms of the trust and working together is ensuring that we're out there. So I think whether there's been counties in Texas with a population of 3,000, or the last time I was in San Francisco visiting with the mayor's office there, every time there's a disaster here, I make sure that we make phone calls even at the local level, to make sure the folks know they've got a partner not only in their state, which is our customers, but also up here in DC. And so it's really, I think, particularly when it comes to public safety, homeland security, resilience, and recovery, is making sure we have those networks together, build that trust among ourselves, so that carries out into the public space.
Great. Thank you, Francisco, for that. If I could just, maybe dig a little bit deeper, because it's a topic that you and I have discussed before around, SBA's, growing role in the resilience side, on being able to provide support for building back better, in an environment where people question the need, question climate change, things like that. How do we still, struggle through and take advantage of the opportunity that agencies like yours are presenting?
One, I think we have to harness the opportunity to do that. Coming off of COVID, where we saw, quite frankly, and I wasn't here at SBA during the COVID, but the agency punched above its weight. $1.4 trillion to millions of businesses across this country, set up programs overnight, implemented those, and got that on the ground. What we saw, actually, and it's a timely question, yesterday marked one full year in this position, and we've gone from the Office of Disaster Assistance to now the Office of Disaster Recovery and Resilience. And to give you a sense of what SBA's role is and the importance of this, since the year 2000, there have only been 4 years where there have been more presidentially declared disasters than there have been major disaster declarations across this country. Our average lending per year for disasters is $1.8 billion, but that's changing. Just in Florida alone this week, as of now, we've done about $1.5 billion. Last year, we had 18 separate billion-dollar disasters, 18 disasters that cost $1 billion or more, and that's just last year alone. And when you're seeing the need, I think the undertold story is how often SBA is on the ground. The chances are you probably do more business with us than you do with FEMA when it comes to disaster declarations across this country. And you may not know that we not only serve businesses, but homeowners, renters, and private nonprofits. And so we're revamping that program to make sure we have the right people in the right jobs, that we are leading from the ground up. And that's why we're talking to local and community partners across this. And we're also making sure, as the name you just mentioned, recovery is inextricable from resilience. And so that's the path moving forward.
Great. Rebecca and Chris, I'd like to go to you on it, because this issue of trust is critical, and is the answer that I think Francisco gave, that is deliver, get the job done, and people will come with you. Rebecca, your thoughts? You think that's a path forward?
Well, it can be a path forward. I think a more informed path forward is to engage people at the local level. Any community that's considering priority-based budgeting, it takes time. Yeah, all engagement takes time. But for people to have a say in how their dollars that they give their local governments are spent, that makes a difference for people. People support what they help build. It's a timeless truth. So don't just do for your citizens at the local level, do with them. And there are a lot of innovative ways to do that.
Wow, no, great thought. Chris, any?
I completely agree. I think engage is the key. And sometimes it doesn't have to be you or the political leadership. It could be trusted social brokers within the community that often, carry a lot of weight in terms of their message. Here in the district, we have very strong community-based organizations, religious-based organizations that can help us, spread preparedness messaging, as well as keeping the community safe.
Great, thanks, Chris. All right, let's introduce our next question, the polling question. If the team could put that one up. This is a question on preferences. Where do you spend most of your time, attention? Please pick one. Do you task focus? Email, agendas, prep. Are you agency, industry focused? Are you professionally development focused to improve your performance or effectiveness? Or are you thinking about emergency issues outside of the industry that would impact your industry or organization? Rebecca, start with you. Does this surprise you?
Well, it aligns with a survey that we had in the field about this very thing. I mean, and the truth is, the first question that we ask, and I assume that most of the people who are with us today, serving the public, in charge, right, would answer yes to this question. The first question is strategy part of your responsibility? And for most of you it is. So then you look at how we spend our time and attention, and tasks, was the highest bar, 37%, I think was the last number I saw. And, Cal Newport has written this book called A World Without Email. And I think we can agree with the premise, like, man, if I had less email, I would have more time to be strategic. But the whole point here is that if we want to be strategic about the future, about threats, about opportunities, we have to spend time doing that. And so this is just a paradox or an alignment question, right? If strategy is your job, but most of us are spending most of our time doing things that are for the next hour, the next week, the next month, when is the strategy work really getting done? And I mean, I'm in the same boat too. I'm a professional futurist, and I spend a large part of my time doing very tactical things.
Wow. Chris, any thoughts or reactions to that?
I think it's also a spectrum. And so, and maybe you move along I think in the graphic there, maybe left to right. So when I started in this role, a little over 5 years ago, I probably spent a lot more time on tasks and sort of the mundane, kind of like very goal-oriented aspects of running an agency. But as I built my team and I became more seasoned in the role, I now spend most of my time on, I think it was the third one there, which is more like the people base, the sort of capacity building within an agency and an organization, advocating for resources, right? Making sure that I'm staying at the strategic level. And also, I think it's really important, and emergency management and Homeland Security shops can range in terms of personnel, and it could be a one-person shop, it could be like a 200-person shop. But I do think no matter how big your agency is, you should always be looking to also like train and mentor your successor. I have a very strong senior leadership team. I have a deputy and a chief of staff who could run the agency if I left tomorrow. And I really do try to make sure that I'm investing in their professional development, and the professional development of our managers. I often say we're not training Homeland Security and emergency management professionals here. We're training executives who know how to manage budgets and resources and personnel, because I want them to be able to be successful no matter where they go. So a big part of my time is now spent on capacity building. I call it institutional thickening of the agency.
Yeah, no, well said. Well said. Francisco.
I wanted to piggyback on sort of what Rebecca and Krista said. I think we have come to the point in this profession of emergency management where we can put emergency out the door and really focus on the management piece of it, because that is absolutely critical. And I spent a bit of time in Texas and will continue to do so in this role, sort of stressing that as we build a team. But I'm also very lucky in that I came on board this organization, as part of a large administrative effort to make change, think strategically, and to the points that have kind of been made. If you're sitting here looking at the computer, doing email, doing tasks, do you have the time to look above your laptop and actually see what's happening in the world around you? And what good are you doing focusing on those tasks in front of you? The way you've done that for years, if you're not willing to adjust and pivot and think strategically about how you can get better outcomes. And so for us, luckily you have a great team that could keep the trains running, but also we have spent a significant part of this past year. I would say 70% of our effort this year was on reimagining, reinventing, taking a deep dive and seeing how we can move forward. And so part for us, now that we've done this, and this is a big focus of this week over at this end, is how do we continue to implement that change, but also create a very strategic, scheduled way to make sure that we make time for strategy, make time for innovation, and really tackle that. And so I think that's critically important, especially when you got, also having that local perspective, as dollars get tight, as challenges grow, how do we invest in that strategic thinking and planning to be able to adapt that, but also, stay ahead of the curve. Yeah.
It's tough, it's the battle of the urgent versus the strategic. And in our profession of crisis management, we find ourselves, being pulled in different directions all the time. Chris, what you said about developing the staff, I find myself referencing things my mother and father told me more and more as I get older. And my mother said to me one time, you know what a parent's true job is? And she had 5 kids. I was the oldest. Says, my job is to make myself entirely useless to you so that you can handle life on your own. And I remember being struck by it, when I first heard it. But I've come to understand that that's true. And it's really our job as leaders to create an organization around us, versus you clearly said, where they don't need us. They could do the job. And what we're there to do is to create the environment that allows them to be successful and to make sure that the environment's in place. But it's great to hear other leaders saying things like that. I think it provides sort of hope for us all going forward. But one of the things this touches on is this idea of the future of work. And I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about that next. And that is, COVID has been called a time machine to the future. It forced us to do things that were likely to take 20 years in terms of accepting how the workplace is designed, and sped it up, made it go much, much faster. And people are expecting it now. Rebecca, the title of your book, Live First, Work Second. That is not the generation I grew up in. So I'm going to show that book to my father, and see what his reaction is. But the reality is that this challenge of the future work is really divided into 3 buckets. There's the people issues and what people's expectations are. It's the way we work, the process, and also what deliverables and products look like. And then, of course, the workplace. What does the workplace become when it's not an essential component? Does it become an area for collaboration or whatever? But all of these things are churning right now as we're addressing all of these risks that we're talking about. What kind of impact do you see this issue having on your teams and your workforce? And Francisco, could I start with you?
Sure. That's something top of mind for us as we have redesigned this disaster enterprise at SBA. A lot of moving parts, a lot of moving boxes in our chart. And so one thing we're trying is retention, is how do we retain good employees? The benefit also for us as we've structured the organization, we've got some openings in leadership and we're cultivating some talent and changing the culture, is, if the job can be done outside of the office and maybe another office in another part of the country or somewhere else. Now we're not just restricted to talent, which is an incredible pool of talent here in DC, but now I've got talent from all over the country that I can pull in for people that want to contribute to the space, that are innovative, that are leaders. And so how do we foster that? And so that's one of the things we're taking a good internal look here, not only at SBA, but particularly here at Disaster Recovery and Resilience, where we've remade this organization, have some moving parts. So moving to personnel is like retention's a critical issue, recruitment, and really allows you to bring in, we all talk about diversity in the workplace, whether it is demographic or in skill set or in thought. For us, that opens the door to be able to have folks be a part of this team. And so for us, I think we need to harness that and continue to move forward in that direction, muddle through some of it, like some of the rest of our colleagues, but I think go in with the open mind in terms of how to do that. And what I have personally found, it's very interesting. I found a work-life balance during COVID. So it's when everyone else was going crazy, somehow what I did realize, it gives you the ability to think more strategically. It gives you sort of I think the outcomes are better. And so how we can encourage that around our staff, and particularly comes with mental health and those kinds of things, and emergency management and public safety, that we need to continue to push that. And I think the outcomes are definitely worth it. And we just, whether we want to move that way or not, that's where the world is going, and we need to harness it and get ahead of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Chris, what do you see?
Yeah, I think Francisco's exactly right. I mean, whether we like it or not, this is where the world is moving. This is the future of work. It's the way that we recruit and retain top talent. There is an expectation now of flexibility and telework, and I think that's a good thing. Our agency throughout the pandemic, we never teleworked. I mean, we came to work every day in the EOC. And then, of course, you had the riots in 2020, and then, of course, the very divisive presidential election, and then all the way up to the inauguration. So our team, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call who work in emergency management agencies and Homeland Security departments, our workforce has been through a lot over the last 3 years. They've had to grapple with so much. And, as long as the work is getting done, people should have the flexibility to be able to work from where they want to work from home in particular. The challenge, though, that I've noticed is, in the emergency management space in particular, we're an agency of partnerships. I mean, we can't do anything really without our partners, with their buy-in, with their support. And so it's really hard to do that, though, over Teams and Zoom and WebEx. And so there are times when I personally struggle as the agency director. Have we moved too far in one direction? Like, what does a more balanced approach look like? For my employees that are on the call, we're not gonna change it posture, but it is something that I think we do have to think about, particularly in the emergency management space, as we engage with our partners. We need that face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, it is tricky. We've done a lot of studies on it, and the firm I work for, and some of the agencies you would think would naturally have everybody work remotely are actually bringing the people back. Organizations like Google, for example. But then you have agencies that you wouldn't think would even entertain any of this, like the United States Air Force, where if you touch a plane, you go to work, okay? Because you can't touch the plane at home. But if you don't touch the plane and you have another role, you work from home, which has been fascinating. Like, again, unexpected, realities are in front of us at all times. And Rebecca, I've got to go to you because I know you've been thinking about this problem and this issue. What are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. One, for state and local governments, the turnover has been insane. Like, as one data point, I'm in North Carolina now. My home is in Wisconsin, but last year I did a remote workshop for for UNC School of Government. And when I asked them, how's registration going? They said the weirdest thing has happened. The registrants, like, we recognize all the names, but 50% of the email addresses have changed. So there is a huge amount of oxygenation. That's how I'm choosing to think about this, of people moving into new roles, taking new roles. And that takes a minute to norm. They say the research, I think HBR, Harvard Business Review, says it takes 3 years for a team to gel. So I'm very optimistic about this because I think oxygenation is key to great, good government. And I'm excited about that. So that's one thing, is the oxygenation. The second thing, the thing that I'm kind of worried about though, is like a Frankenstein workplace where we do the worst of in-person and we do the worst of remote, and we end up with like this place nobody wants to work. I heard a fascinating statistic from an HR director in a Mountain West community in Colorado, fast-growing community. They posted for a job, like many local governments are doing, and they're trying to get candidates. She had 63 candidates who were interested. And when she posted that there was no remote option, meaning like you can't even work at home 1 day a week, 60 of the 63 candidates withdrew. 60 of the 63 candidates withdrew. So I think what has happened, like Francisco said, I have better work-life balance now. I think a lot of us have gone through an existential crisis, certainly some disruption, and we're clearer about what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do. And across Maine right now, lots of local governments are going to 4-day work weeks. It started with one, and then others, to be competitive, were like, us too. So we're not there yet where we're going to settle out, but we're getting there. And by all means, avoid a Frankenstein situation.
Well said. Let's hope the monster doesn't get created. Absolutely. You mentioned Cal Newport. I haven't read that book, the email book, but I did read Deep Work, and I'm still processing it, in terms of, how do you actually do things? And I mentioned that because I'd like to have our final question be brought up by the team so we can take a look at this issue before we go to questions from the audience. Okay, how many hours each month do you spend with your leadership team talking about the future of your community or state in 2025 and beyond? I think it's still moving a little bit, but again, this looks like a pretty clear picture. Less than 30 minutes a month is in the lead, 30 to 90 minutes and is next, and then more than 90. A interesting distribution. And Rebecca, I'll start with you again on this. What is this telling you, and is it reflective of other studies you've seen?
Yeah, well, the benchmark, and this is from an older article, but C.K. Prahalad did an article for Harvard Business Review about how do we spend our time? Like, we kind of get the future that we think about. And if we're not thinking about the future, it's going to be full of surprises. And what he found is that senior executives spend less than 3% of their time, 2.4% of their time is spent thinking with their teams about the future. And we put a survey like this out in the field, and we found on average, people spend between 1.5 minutes and 4.5 minutes a day thinking with their teams about the future. And my only argument here, or my challenge to the audience, is, we think of emergencies as happening to us, right? But the future is also based on how we take action on the future, and spending time thinking with people you trust or need or collaborate with, thinking together about the future that's evolving, is usually time well spent.
Yeah, wow. Francisco, these numbers surprise you?
No, but I will tell you again, I'll have to caveat that I'm coming from a very unique place in that I do, and my team do probably more than 90 minutes a day, but we have spent the past year kind of doing this. So that's a little bit of a caveat, but I will it's an interesting question, because I will, emergency managers in particular in the audience here should probably be doing this naturally more than anybody else, because as emergency managers, our job isn't to think, right, Chris, about what's happening right now. What's happening 12, 36 hours from now, 48 hours from now, 72 hours from now. That's what we do. It's what we should be doing. So we just need to translate that and carry that over into like how we do that strategically for our organizations. It's something we do in every crisis, and there's crisis abound. We're doing that all the time. So how do we take that model that we already do in emergency management and simply apply it to the organization rather than the crisis that's in front of us right now? So it should be an easy jump, I hope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, not much to add to what Rebecca and Francisco said. I think that's right. Emergency managers. I remember one of my key counterparts in the mayor's cabinet. I asked him at one point, what do you expect from HCMA? And he said, I need someone to look around the corner, right? tell me things that I'm not thinking about right now. And so we spend a lot of time, our leadership team, talking about the future, not just externalities in terms of threats, but also internal to the organization. How are we cultivating our leaders? What are we doing to incentivize people to stay? We did HR surveys in our agency, and we're relatively small, and the reason why a lot of people leave our agency is because there's not a lot of growth opportunities, not a lot of management positions or senior level positions. And so how are we keeping people engaged? So we talk about those things a lot. And I think Rebecca and Francisco are right. Like, it is time well spent, because it does prepare you for the future.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. Yeah, I look at that, and I look at the other questions that we've asked, and I personally, and I think many of us are, like you go to, you sit down at your desk at 6-7 o'clock in the morning. Yes, it's old school, but yeah, it's 6 o'clock. And then the next thing you know, it's 6 o'clock at night, right? And you're like, where did the day go? And you did all these tasks. That's why that Cal Newport book was so interesting, because he makes the argument that if you don't block out hours of time to really just focus on something, that you're really not doing your best. So I find that whole issue fascinating, and it really speaks to, we can look at all these challenges to sort of sum all this up into, that the webinar series has pointed out the challenges they face. It's how we're going to address them, and the new tools and the new way approaches that I think are really going to make a difference, which is why both these conversations are so important. With that, thank you, panelists. I'm going to now turn it over to Dawn and for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Mike. And you actually teed up our first question in your reference to tools and resources. Rebecca, several questions in the Q&A for resources or tools, and you mentioned demand signals earlier. Any advice or recommendations for leaders on the line today who want to engage in more future and foresight planning?
Did we record that session we did in your shop in August? We did a great workshop on signals and sense making, and just how simple it is to get people together to talk about the longer range future. I think Francisco and Chris, you're right on the money. You do this all the time for 12, 24, 36 hours. What if we just lengthened the time horizon a little bit, and also maybe had some other voices? So you can Google signals and sense making. I've got a couple articles, a few videos about how to do it. MIT Sloan has a whole discipline in their MBA program about this very thing. And Francisco and Chris, I wonder, like, when you're looking for signals of the future, what are some of the sources that you guys refer to? Like, who's in your back pocket?
For us, I find a lot of people that had back in Texas, we built an emergency management shop. We brought people from expertise that probably about 60% were not from emergency management. They brought different skill sets. I could see the future, but I recognize I like to consider myself fairly open-minded, but I know I've got blinders on somewhere. And so sometimes I will just, if there's a topic where I have no problem picking up, looking for an expert online, give them a call and say, hey, my name's Francisco, do you have a minute? Whether I know them or not. And so I think, and then also making sure that we interject, where possible, that into our planning process. But we don't know. I think everyone on this call is pretty well networked, but we don't know a vast majority, 99% of the experts that are out there on things that we're talking about. And again, we talked about interdependencies earlier. We need our future, our sense making to be really holistic, because we don't live in a silo. So that's critically important in my end.
Yeah, I agree. I think your professional and personal networks are really important to be able to tap when you're struggling with something or a question or a problem. I certainly do that. Another thing that we do is, we do empower a lot of our workforce to raise issues and to say, hey, does this make sense? If you're new to the organization, please let us know. If from an outsider's view, sometimes things need to be changed, and we've tried to really build in a culture of that's okay. Like no one's going to be like held accountable, but like don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to like try something and it doesn't work. I think that that's a really big part of the culture we're trying to build here.
Chris, the next question actually falls onto your comment just now about really following demand signals, and several questions in the chat about mis and disinformation. And you certainly in the National Capital Region live in the midst of that. Any advice for viewers to kind of figure out ground truth? How do you, in an emergency management, homeland security profession, or in your perch in DC, how do you figure out and handle misinformation, and how is that manifesting itself as a security threat for you in the district?
Yeah, this is this is an issue, obviously, I think not just for the district and National Capital Region, but for the country. And I would say to my emergency management colleagues on the line, you need a seat at the table when we're talking about intelligence and the threat landscape that's out there, whether it be from your state fusion centers or your city fusion centers, or with the local police department or the FBI. A big concern that I have in coming into this role, and I'm not an emergency manager by trade. I'm an intel analyst. Spent 11 years at CIA before making the move into Homeland Security and emergency management. You need to have that seat at the table. Getting the ground truth, reading the intelligence, seeing what's out there, and having those trusted brokers and information areas out there that you need to engage in. It is absolutely, in my view, and I don't want to say anything that gonna insult anyone, but emergency managers should have access to classified information and to traditional LES, as long as law enforcement sensitive information, as long as it's not compromising investigations and it's not revealing information that a police department is holding. But we need to have a better sense of the threat, because and the impacts of misinformation, disinformation, because when something goes bad, yes, we have our first response agencies, but when an emergency manager will need to garner and mobilize the entire system to be able to support response and recovery. You need to have a sense of what's going on in your jurisdiction. And fortunately, here in the district, we have great relationships with the Metropolitan Police Department, which is our lead law enforcement agency in the district. They're phenomenal partners. And with our federal entities as well. So I would encourage people to really, really build those relationships with intelligence and law enforcement to get that ground truth and to read the information on your own. Don't have it briefed to you, but read it, and then come to conclusions on your own.
Francisco, lots of chat in the Q&A about your comments about pivoting towards resiliency as a framework for the nation, and several questions asking, any advice for what you're leading at HUD or in the broader national discourse to really engage local businesses, small businesses, and local community leaders to evaluate and take a look at their own resiliency capabilities? How are you leading those conversations?
Yes, and so right now we're leaning into that. That's actually a huge priority, sort of the first quarter and second quarter of this year. Now we spent a year sort of revamping sort of our organization. But look, one of the challenges to resilience or capital, how do you? Everybody knows that if you don't mitigate it now, you're going to pay 2 or 3 times what is down the future. And so how do we do that? And so one of the things we're talking about in local communities is, for example, we've got mitigation lending that you can access, but at SBA, but you have to have been impacted by a disaster. You can only mitigate against the disaster you were just impacted by. So we're going to go back and look at how do we change that how do we do mitigation lending beforehand, and how do we, we live in an all hazards world, so how do we do that? So we're also doing a lot of education right now in local communities about the programs as it is now and how they might evolve, but also working on making sure that we provide education on resilience. Here's one of the things that I found as I visited with local communities across the country is business owners and local economies are interested very much in building resiliency, but they're also working to keep the lights on. And so I think what's helpful for them is resources and information. What does resiliency mean? What does it mean for you in your specific community? Because that's different in the Northwest than it is in the Southwest and across this country, and sometimes just a state or even in the next state. And then giving local communities options and education about you don't have to. What is something that you can do to mitigate and build resilience right now that's affordable, low-hanging fruit? And what's at the other end of the spectrum, and what's everything in between? So as we have those discussions across the country, that's kind of one of our priorities, is education, building the resources so the small business owners and local economies can find an easy place to find that's a trusted source of information, and then explaining what their range is and make sure that it's accessible to everybody based on recommendations we might have on what they can do.
Francisco, thank you to that. Mike, mindful of time, I'm going to turn it back over to you and the panelists for closing thoughts and comments.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks for those questions. Panelists, it's been a privilege to chat with you and to get your insights. I certainly learned a lot. But just one more time, go around the horn here and see if you have any closing thoughts for the audience. Chris, start with you.
Yeah, just thank you very much for the opportunity to have these discussions today. Mike, thank you. Francisco, Rebecca, it's been great being on the panel with you. I would encourage all of our counterparts on the line. I don't want to steal Rebecca's thunder, but work in the future, right? Always be thinking about what the next step is, what's around the corner. Build those partnerships and relationships. They're absolutely critical to you doing your job. And if anyone ever needs anything, be happy to talk and to connect. So thank you very much, Mike.
Right, thanks. Rebecca.
Yes, I'm going to build on that, which is, if you're in a room with your colleagues and you know how most of the sentences are going to end and you know how most of the meetings will resolve, you need to broaden your inputs, right? Because being in an echo chamber, to me, is the opposite of resilience. It means you're surrounded with like-minded people. So whether that's younger people or Chris, new people, or Francisco picking up the phone or dropping somebody a note on LinkedIn and say, hey, can I have 20 minutes of your time? I got these 2 questions. But that openness and curiosity, we get to a stage in our careers where we think we have the answers, but that is a trick. So get in rooms and get with people who are going to challenge you and give you different perspective. And thank you, Mike, for great moderation. And thanks all of you for your public service.
Thanks, Rebecca. Francisco.
I appreciate Rebecca's last comment. I'll tell you, I've had the opportunity, I said, to be on command staff for 4 of our nation's 10 most costly natural disasters. And I'm only an expert at the disasters I've experienced. I have no expertise in the one that's coming in front of me. And so a little humility is important. I will have a shameless plug for SBA. We have over 70 something district offices across this country, and small businesses are really the giants of our economy. Almost 50% of the national workforce. We've seen how critical that is post-COVID to do that. So in whatever space you're in, your local economy is essential. It's critical with all these interdependencies, so that businesses can grow, the economies locally can thrive, and people can prosper. So the district offices don't fall under my portfolio, but we do have a whole of SBA approach. If you don't know your leaders in your district offices of SBA, reach out and get to know them.
That's great. Thanks. And it's not a shameless plug. It's just good information, Francisco. So thank you for that. Thank you again, panelists, and audience. Thank you so much for joining with us and sharing your points of view and the questions, both that we polled and that you asked. I'll just close, but we've got challenges. But in chatting with folks like you, I have a complete hope that we're going to solve these challenges. And the other thing is we're going to solve them in new ways. And I will, those that are watching this that have worked with me in the past, know that there's rule number 1 of working with Mike, and that is save Mike from himself. And there's a corollary that says if Mike left to his own devices, we'll be stupid. So that's why you have to save him. So knowing people like you and the people that called in today is what keeps me out of trouble. And so I'm grateful for your guidance and your thoughts, and I hope to see you all soon in the future. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Mike, thank you again for moderating today's panel. And again, thank you to our panelists for joining us. You also can access the recordings from our earlier installments in the America in Transition webinar series on that page. And we'll certainly provide that link in an email to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you again to everyone in our audience for your service today and throughout the nation.